Have you guys ever heard a company talk about safety as our primary mission? Safety is number one. I've heard it, and every time I hear it, I think, well, if you're an aviation company, park your airplanes. That's the best way to fulfill your primary mission of safety. So that doesn't really work for me. On the other hand, you sometimes hear about a pilot that's described as a risk taker. The adrenaline of the risk is what fulfills that pilot. I think those are two examples of the extremes here. The former is risk avoidance, and the latter is risk taking without regard to the impact of that risk. All of us in this room are not on the extremes. I suggest all of us in this room do what we call risk management, where we acknowledge the risks out there, we put steps in place to mitigate those risks, and then we get to a level where we're willing to accept those risks. Let me ask you, have you ever had the sense that there's turbulence coming up and tightened your seatbelt? That's risk mitigation. Okay? I know if I don't tighten it up there, I could get bounced around in the cockpit, hit my head up on the top. I'm going to just tighten that down to stop that. That's an example of risk mitigation, and that's what we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so. It's nothing that you don't already do. Now, last year we talked about risk management. Some of you were here last year, so you might be saying to yourself, hey, Dan, I already do risk management. I heard you talk about it last year. There are some that weren't here last year, so this is going to be a good discussion about that. But I suggest that for the former, it still is important for us to think about risk management. And indeed, I think that should be the lens that we all look at every single aerodynamic decision that we take. Now, for you maintenance people, for the non-flyers out here, I'm going to also suggest that this particular lens can be used for everything that we do. And that's why this is important. We're going to talk about it because even though we all do it, we can do it better, right? It's just like any science out there that if you study it, look at it from an academic perspective, you can employ it better in the future. And that's our goal today. Next slide, please. In the Navy, we talked about risk management quite a bit, but we do that in general aviation, talk about it quite a bit as well. Indeed, this comes from the FAA's risk management report that I'm going to frequently cite during this presentation. And this is the ORM process. So we'll take a look at the steps of the ORM process. First of all, we identify hazards. That's the very first step. We then assess those hazards. Is it something we really should be concerned with? Is it something we should be very, very concerned with? And we'll deal with it appropriately after we've assessed the hazard. We'll make a risk decision. The risk decision is this: is the risk out there worth the mission that we have? I talked about companies that say safety is mission one. That's not our mission. Predominantly our mission is to have fun. It's a valuable mission. It enriches our lives. It enriches those around us because we're happier. I understand that to be our mission, and it's probably the same for almost everybody sitting here today. So it's worth doing, but we want to make sure that the risks associated with it don't make it not worth doing. Make sense on that? The good news is once we've assessed all those risks, then we can move on to step 3, make those decisions. And if you've ever not flown because of the weather out there, that's a risk decision that you made. Flying in this weather is not worth the mission that I want to accomplish, which is have fun. I'll do it tomorrow. All right? That's ORM in practice, and you all do it. I know you do. Step 4 is the good news here. There are controls that we can implement that will lower either the risk of it happening, of the hazard becoming a reality, or mitigate how bad the risk would be if it did come into fruition. Those are controls. And this is where I specifically ask that we all rededicate ourselves to academically, specifically, formally putting in risk mitigation steps in our everyday life. That's what we're going to be talking about, and we've got examples of that in practice coming up. And then finally, we need to supervise. Did I tighten the belt tight enough? Am I still getting bounced around too much? That's a supervise of a hazard control that you put in. We're going to assess whether it's good. We're going to do an OODA loop, if you guys know what I'm talking about there. And then we're going to figure out whether we need to do something different. All right? So that's the ORM, Operational Risk Management Process. Any questions about that? In the Navy, for this identify hazards, we used to have what we called human factors boards, okay? Human factors boards were mandated by the Navy, and where senior pilots had to get together periodically and talk about each and every pilot in your squadron. And we wanted to identify stressors that were on each individual pilot. That's powerful, right? Stressors, there was no subjectiveness to this. There are identified stressors in one's life that affect performance more than others. Examples are going through a divorce, getting married, children with health problems. Those are just examples of stressors in somebody's life. So if you think about it, the Human Factors Board was helping in step one. Next slide, please. This is straight from the FAA Risk Management Handbook. And I'm going to offer this as probably a good way because we have to acknowledge we don't have our chain of command assessing us periodically. We've got to do that ourselves, right? So we have to identify hazards, and we have to do that in a meticulous, formal way. Otherwise, some of the hazards are going to go unnoticed. So this is structure to your thought, and that's really, it typifies what I'm trying to offer you today, is to provide structure in your ORM process. Nothing more. I know you already do it. But the structure here to identify risks are looked at via the PAVE checklist. So pilot, aircraft, environment, external pressures. So we ought to periodically, and at least once before we go flying, think of it in those terms. Did I identify the hazards in one of those bins or not? Certainly the pilot portion of it is, the good example is that Human Factors Board. Because we don't have a chain of command, we have other tools that we can assess ourselves. First of all, how we are feeling, right? We can assess ourselves as far as, do you have a cold coming on? Is there congestion? How's your overall health? How's your mental health today? Are you depressed about something? Are some stressors impacting me? If friends or coworkers ask about something going on in your life, that could be an indication that I need to deep down a little, dive a little bit more. I don't know about you, but my first inclination when somebody says, "Are you sure you should be flying today?" I bristle at that. That's my visceral response to that. Of course I've looked at all this. I'm a professional pilot, right, Shortney? Of course I've looked at all these indications. How dare you? Well, that's an unhealthy response to somebody saying, "Are you sure you should be able to fly?" So I have to physically or mentally structure my brain to say, wait a second, give that person some grace on this thing, and that person is doing that out of love and is doing that in my best interest. Maybe I ought to listen to that. Maybe that's my Human Factors Board, okay? So assessing yourself, you have internal cues and you also have external cues from pilots that you trust and friends and family that you trust on that. On the aircraft side, pretty straightforward there. Is there a coolant leak on your airplane? It's not much. I can go with it. Is there a brown stain on your airplane that didn't show up before? Those are cues that maybe I should take a look and identify that hazard. I'm not saying don't go flying. I am saying identify that as a hazard, and let's put some steps into the place to mitigate that. If I have a brown stain, it might be taking the cowlings off and looking. That's ORM in practice, okay? The next one is environment. So that not only includes weather, and we are all aware of weather and how it affects us in our daily life, but it includes other things. Is there restricted airspace nearby? How are the controllers? Do I even have controllers? Do I have a flight school nearby? All of that is environment that can present to you a hazard that needs to be dealt with. And then finally, external pressures. This is one of the hardest ones for me to really identify and put steps in to mitigate it. Do I feel the need to go flying today? If I didn't fly, what would that do to my mental makeup? I might be applying more pressure than really deserves in this particular case. Am I trying to build up flight time for an inspection? That is an external pressure that we could apply ourselves to this. Am I wanting to show the person I'm flying with how good of a pilot I am? That's an external pressure. They're out there. Just because they're identified doesn't ground you, but it certainly makes us take the next step in the ORM process. Questions about that or any thoughts on that? Next slide. Now we're going to assess. And there's academics behind assessing risks. It's not this. It's not, okay, it feels right. It's the risk assessment cube. You've probably all at one point or another have looked at that. The two axes on here says the probability of that hazard becoming a reality, and then the outcome and whether it's going to be devastating or not. So if the probability is frequent, then those hazards identified change colors. If, on the other hand, it's unlikely, then the colors become dampened down. Make sense? That's intuitive. On this side of it, it's catastrophic. If this hazard becomes a reality, what's that going to cause to myself, to my friends and family, to the airplane itself? How bad is it going to be? Catastrophic on the top, negligible on the bottom, all right? Each and every hazard should be assigned a place in that cube. The green here that's an acceptable risk. I'm going to take that risk, and I'm going to continue on with my life. If it's yellow, it means I need to put a step in there, and I need to figure out some way to mitigate that overall risk back into the green. Notice I can reduce the probability, or I can reduce the severity of the risk to drive it to a different color. And take heed, if you've got things up on the top left quadrant, you really, really need to have some good steps to put that in. And one of those steps might be defer your flying till later. Make sense? Next slide, please. I'm gonna walk through a scenario. It's the same scenario I talked about last year, but it really doesn't matter the scenario. We're going to talk about wire strikes, but my goal is not to educate you on wire strikes to prevent any sort of a wire strike in the next year. That would be a lovely, lovely outcome to this. But my goal is to talk about the ORM process, the risk management process. So see if I got it right here. Our identified hazard today is a wire strike because I'm going to be landing on the St. John River for the first time. Haven't landed on this section of the river ever before. So that's the identified risk that I have said to myself I need to put through the ORM process to see if it's a risk that I am willing, or a hazard that I am willing to accept. The probability, severity, catastrophic. I know that from not last year, but the year before that. We had 2 wire strikes that caused fatalities on that. So that's a pretty significant severity to have in a wire strike. Make no mistake about it. If you run into a wire, the chances are that you're going to die. And the person that you have in the airplane is going to die with you. And I don't mean to be melodramatic about that, but that's what the data informs us of, okay? That's a catastrophic hazard out there. The decision is that I need to implement controls. So just follow along with me and see if the controls we've implemented bring that risk down in the risk cube to an acceptable level. I'm going to implement those controls. We'll see that in the next slide. And then we're going to supervise continuously, and I'm going to offer you ways to supervise your hazard risk mitigation steps as we go along. Okay, next slide. First of all, for pre-flight. Pre-flight is, can you go back one slide for a second? Okay, we talked about that. So our goal is to drive down and right. All right, next slide. On the pre-flight, I'm going to use ForeFlight. I use it every flight, every single flight. If it's CAVE and bright lights outside, I still use ForeFlight to look at where I'm going to be flying around. In this particular case, I'm going to scrutinize ForeFlight to see, using the map function, to see any areas that I really need to look at. And on this particular example, I found one that I really need to take a look at. And the way I see it is this cutout here. Of course, I can't see the wires, but I can see the cutout. And where there's a cutout through a forest, you ought to be suspecting wires there.
And Danno,
yes.
ForeFlight now has a change. The known wires and the big wires are actually highlighted
right.
like towers on the map.
So great point, and a real good tool to mitigate the risk of wire strikes out there. Next slide. This is really important. And in retrospect, I wish we had asked in the survey who was a member of the Seaplane Pilots Association. It's an incredibly useful tool to have. So if you're not a member, please consider becoming a member of Seaplane Pilots Association. It's not just the benefit of knowing where the fly-ins are, and there's a lot of benefits to being a SPA member. But in this particular case, it can certainly help us. So we're going to look at their database. The database is not complete. It's just one more tool for us to look at, all right? And in the SPA database, it has landing areas, lakes out there in your vicinity, and it will tell whoever has, as a pilot, put in okay, there's wires over here, watch out for that. It will show up in the database. This is a great example of it. This is the St. John River, no known restrictions. So there's no known you can't land there. If it was restricted, it'd say restricted. If it was closed, it would say closed. A really good tool to know where you can land at. This is another one. It's Lake Hickory around here. Take a look at the comment here. Nice, although fairly narrow lake. There are several sections of power lines across the lake, so beware. Can you see how we're mitigating the risk there by looking at this stuff? If you can, become a member. It's a very good tool for you to have. Next slide. Now I'm going to personally assess. And again, I don't have a human factors board doing this for me, so I'm going to personally assess where I am. What's my total flight hours and my flight hours and type? Who's the most hazardous flyer out there? Is it the brand new pilot?
It's you, Danno.
It's me. Yeah. This is from riskandinsurancecompany.com. So this is the insurance folks, and I go to them quite a bit for assessment of where the best hazards are out there for me to mitigate. And this shows the flight hours with the chance of having a mishap. So we're all, as the Admiral pointed out, we're all experienced pilots, but how much time do we have in that particular airplane, in the Super Petrel? These are things that you're going to ask yourself. When I do training, the brand new pilots that are just flight time building, frankly, it's a lot easier for me, to be perfectly honest with you. The most challenging pilot to train is the one that has a lot of hours and has started to say to himself, I'm pretty good. That's the hardest one to train, okay? Everybody's trainable, but that's the most difficult one to train. The one that comes in and says, I'm just learning this, I've got to get out my checklists, and I've got to follow the procedures that are written in blood to the letter. Those are the ones that are down here on the left-hand side of this curve right here. So assess yourself. Look, I've got 960 hours or so in the Super Petrel. Frankly, in the LS, I'm extraordinarily comfortable. I always remind myself, some of you have heard me say this before, but I always remind myself of what I talked to my daughter when she was learning to fly. I said there's two important things. The one important thing is learn your scan and be meticulous about your scan. And the second thing is realize you're never as good or as bad as you think you are that day. So I get into this airplane and I start flicking switches and I say to myself, seriously, I do this. I say, Dan, you're not this good. Okay, pull out my checklist and then I turn switches on with my checklist. I suggest we should all be doing that. You're never as good or as bad as you think you are at that particular moment. That's a form of risk mitigation. Medical assessment, how am I feeling today? Did anything happen in the near past that could affect my flight right now? All self-assessment of in general aviation, it's relying completely on us to make that final call. And then the time of day, a huge factor out there. You could do all this flight planning and then know where the sun is going to be and whether the sun is going to hide the wires out there. All right? So time of day is extraordinarily important for us amphib pilots that are flying low and close to the ground and water. I watch these podcasts quite a bit about young low-time people that are just learning how to fly. I love watching them for some reason. This was one of them. And this guy talked about what's a good and a bad pilot. And I've always had trouble figuring out what's a good and a bad pilot on this. And he goes, one thing I know for certain is that a bad pilot ignores checklists, ignores getting rusty, or allows that pilot to get rusty, has overconfidence, reacts to internal and external distractions in an unhealthy way, and does poor flight planning. Those things resonated with me, and I hope they do with you. Because I can come back after a successful mission, and the successful mission can be defined as having fun. But did any of these things happen out there? If so, I wasn't as good of a pilot as I wanted to be that day. All right, next slide. So that's a personal assessment on it. And now we're going to implement controls, and in flight, we're going to execute those controls with the overall intent of driving that hazard down and to the right. Some of the controls I suggest for this particular scenario are on the board right here. First of all, I'm going to do a high recon pass. I formally, in my own mind, say that pass is going to be at 1,000 feet, AGL. I don't just go up and I say, I'm just going to fly high and then I'm going to fly low. I formally set an altitude, and then because I always strive to be a better pilot today than yesterday, I check myself on how well I am meticulous on the altitude that I have selected on that. So I'll do a high pass at 1,000 feet, and then I'll do a low recon pass at 500 feet. And remember, the databases are only as good as what's put into the database. And I talked about the Seaplane Pilots Association. That's only as good as you and I make it. All right? So all of those great ideas and discussions are risk mitigating factors, but taken one at a time, they don't bring that cube down into the color that we want it, okay? So it has to all come together to do that. So great discussion on that. This is another really important one for me. Mentally mark all the towers in the area. That's in my own mind. And so when I go out there and I do my high pass and I do my low pass, I look for where the towers are and see if it matches my pre-flight vision of where that would all be. That way I'll notice if there's something out of place and I won't habituate that out of my cognizance. Does that make sense to you guys? So I mentally make, I say this is what it's going to look like before I go flying. Then when I go flying, if it looks like that, all is good as we thought. But if something will pop out at me, and that's been the case for me in a couple of examples. Mark talked about this safe out path. You can do all of your planning and say, okay, this is clear as far as I know. This is all clear for me, and I can do a landing. But I know I got to get out of here. If you haven't done your safe out analysis ahead of time, you could still have that hazard be too high and to the left. Make sense? Next slide, please. So we're going to do those passes and we're going to look at our high recon pass. And sure enough, you can see at glance, here's the cutout for all of the wires that we have picked out on our map and our sectional. We see them out there. As you go in here, you can't see the wires at all, but you certainly see the telltale signs, right? All right? And so the cutouts are going to be your friend as far as putting your eyes where they need to be to try and find that particular wire that we're of concern with here. Next slide. The low path, we can see the same similar things where we can start to break out the high wires. Now granted, these are not the wires that Mark described in his. It's not a telephone wire going over a small section of the water. These are, as expected, are high tension, high power wires out there. So it's all making sense as I'm going out there and all as I envisioned it going out there. And so that's a good thing. Next slide. Now we're going to supervise. When I was emphasizing building that mental picture, that was actually a step towards supervising out there. Because if you think about it, if I have this picture, something leapt out at it, that's an example of supervising your risk mitigation steps, all right? And if that does happen, you know it deserves particular attention as you're flying out there. Are all the known wires accounted for? Are there any unmarked wires out there? Are all the nearby towers accounted for? And have I put my eyes on each one of those towers that I was expecting? Next slide. So the conclusion is, as I mentioned right at the start, we all do it. We all do risk management, whether you've called it that or not. But now if we can frame it to make our procedure, look, Mark talked about his experience out there. Frankly, he's a much, much more intuitive pilot than I'll ever be. I'm just telling you the truth on this. He's a very naturally gifted pilot. That's okay with me, but I know that I have to structure my approach to flying more than maybe he has to or anybody else has to out there. So I like to academically structure my flights, and I like to assess myself as I'm flying, how close to the altitudes, how's my airspeed control, things like that. I apply that same rigor to risk management, and I ask that you consider doing the same thing. The foot stomper for me is, we're not eliminating all risks out there. This is still an unforgiving environment whenever you're flying an airplane. But what I'm offering is that if you academically apply rigor to your risk management approach, then you can significantly lower the hazards that are identified out there, and you can take steps to mitigate those. That's the only thing I'm saying. And for the maintainers out there, lest you think we're just talking about wire strikes, no, we're not. We're talking about everything that we do as far as mitigating our risks. Operational risk management got a bad name, but it's really the lens that we need to apply to everything that we do out there. That's my thesis on it.